Hello, I'm Craig Coulter, and I'm EY's Global Aerospace and Defense Leader, and I have the privilege of moderating our FIN session today on sustainability, the future of clean skies, financial and human stability. So, as you all are aware, commercial air travel has been one of the hardest hit sectors by the pandemic. And so this session really provides an excellent forum to explore the challenges and opportunities of still trying to incorporate sustainability robustly into air travel on an ongoing basis. And for that, we have wonderful representation across the value chain in commercial aviation for the discussion. I'm personally excited to hear from my colleagues about how we can accelerate sustainable growth through the pandemic. So before we launch in, I think the last thing that I would say is just to give a little definition around sustainability for the purposes of the session. So if we leverage the ESG nomenclature, so environmental, social, and governance, the session and my questions were largely focused on environmental considerations, but we certainly don't want to ignore social and governance factors as well. So quite open to exploring those topics. And we can certainly work through that with the panel. So with that, I'll ask the panel to introduce themselves and just take a few minutes to talk about their organization and what they're doing in sustainability, and then we can go from there. So, Chris, why don't we go to you? Just get overview and go from there.
Thank you, Craig, and it's a real honor to have Boeing part of the panel. So thanks for having us. We certainly still are committed to the full ESG definition of sustainability, but I would say, given the current times, there's certainly more current activity on the social dimensions. And by that, I really mean our employees, our stakeholders. Really, you think about the health, the well-being, the racial injustices that we're going through now. And the focus, first and foremost for us, was on employees. I think we're an early adopter of remote work. We've established really robust communications with our employees each week. Dave Calhoun talks to all managers each week. We created a website for medical information that's gotten over 2.5 million hits already. So that was first and foremost in our mind, were our own employees and our suppliers. And then we really moved to Confident Travel Initiative. And I know you will have Mike Delaney on another panel here talking about that from Boeing. But it was important to us to really stand up a team, get really focused on our airline customers and the flying public, and do what we could do to put educational information out there into the system, and also start to explore, new technologies, innovations that may help with the cleanliness issue going forward. So Mike will talk about it, but we're really focused on, how do we prevent the virus from ever reaching the plane, protecting the planes themselves, and then also, of course, preventing the transmission and limiting the transmission with the passengers. And I think to date, we've had somewhere near 150 engagements with airlines across 4 different symposia. I think we've talked to 150 different media or industry experts, and every day we're engaged with all the aviation associations around this. It's just that important. And then, lastly, we need to stay focused on our innovations and investments around the environmental side. But in the current environment, certainly social is a bigger topic.
So, Tom, thinking about the value chain, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Craig. Real pleasure to be on the panel today. So my role is with Air BP, so BP's aviation fuel and marketing supplier. So I can speak both from the BP group perspective and also from Air BP. So the BP is in the process of reinventing the company. And has a new purpose since February this year to reimagine energy for people and our planet. And that's a real focus towards our ambition of net zero by 2050 or sooner, and to help the world to get there as well. So a real reframing of what we do within BP. What we do within Air BP is obviously focused around the supply of aviation fuel. We've actually been a carbon neutral operator since 2016. We see our role within that value chain as really taking a leading position within managing our own emissions within that supply chain, and then providing our customers with options to reduce their emissions, primarily through both the supply of sustainable aviation fuel, which I'm sure we'll come back to later, and also carbon offsets, which form an important mechanism within an overall carbon reduction plan.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Paul?
So it's Paul Stein from Rolls-Royce, where I'm the CTO. So we always start with the statement that aviation is a force for good. It connects the world, and it's our job to get aviation flying again, moving again, but sustainably. With the journey to net zero by 2050 being a necessity to help with climate change and our contribution to reducing global CO2. At the Paris Air Show, all of the world's aviation CTOs got together, so myself and Boeing and Airbus and General Electric and the other major companies, and decided that for the flying machine at least, pursuing three pillars with the elements of sustainability. And since Paris, we've stuck to those three pillars. And those three pillars are, first of all, a relentless pursuit of efficiency in airplane engine combinations. Secondly, as Thomas said, the necessity to scale up sustainable aviation fuels to the levels required to really make a difference. And again, I'll come back to those. And the third is to start exploring novel technologies, new propulsion methods. It has to be said, whilst electrification and hydrogen and series hybrid will play a part, most of those technologies are really for shorter range aircraft. And there are very few of those technologies that will take you more than 1,000 kilometers. Hence, as Tom is quite right, the need for the massive scale up of sustainable aviation fuels is a necessary component in decarbonising aviation. In airframe engine combinations, our own big contribution has been a project called UltraFan, which is an ambitious ultra-high bypass engine, a new type of engine that takes you the next 10% on. But also more and more, we're working with companies such as BP and Shell and Total and the great oil companies of the world to see how we can scale up sustainable aviation fuels, initially using existing sources of renewable power, but eventually nuclear power as an energy source for creating e-fuels that we can really start to motor in getting the tonnage that we need. And I'll come back to some of these themes later, but back to you, Craig.
All right. Thanks, Paul. I really appreciate it. Tony?
Thanks, Craig. Hello, everybody. My name's Tony Douglas. I'm the Chief Executive of Etihad, and I'm here in Abu Dhabi. And I have to say, as a result of COVID, I'm bitterly disappointed I'm not at Farnborough this time round. Obviously, COVID dominates the aviation agenda at the moment, but in no way does it overshadow the work that was going on and the commitments that we'd previously made to sustainability with a capital S. And I think it's fair to say we, in collaboration with many others, have been very active for some time. I think notably the initiative, interestingly, at the Dubai Air Show last year, when we unveiled the Greenliner in collaboration with Boeing, it's a 787 aircraft, with GE and a whole bunch of other partners, to really put this aircraft out there as a test bed for optimization purposes. And since then, we've run all manner of different programs, be it in terms of when the aircraft was originally delivered to us from Boeing, we had 30% biofuel as part of the incoming fuel load. So everything from alternative fuels, the way in which we've been looking at new decision-making techniques for pilots to optimize route planning. We've run a number of flights with continuous descents, optimizing flight schedules in order to try and tune every last bit of opportunity from that test bed. And I think there's a few other things I should quickly mention. On Earth Day, we also went for a reusable plastics only flight, so single use was completely banned. And in doing that, we've been able to develop a capability that's allowed us to pledge that we'll get to 80% ban by 2022. And importantly for us, later on this year, we're taking our next 787-10 aircraft from Boeing, and in partnership with GE, with Safran, and with NASA, we're putting this aircraft out there as an eco demonstrator. So it'll have between 4 and 5 weeks of flying in order to experiment with a whole range of new optimization techniques. So I think I'll come back to some of those perhaps in more detail later on. But I'd like to stress that notwithstanding the huge impact that COVID has brought, it's not an and or conversation. It's very much sustainability and dealing with wellness and well-being.
Thank you, Tony. Really appreciate it. And Grant?
Thanks very much. Well, I'm Grant Shapps. I'm Secretary of State for Transport in the United Kingdom, and I'm really delighted to be here today and on this call, but absolutely gutted not to be at Farnborough this year, not least because I think last 2 years ago, I actually got to fly in myself, which was absolutely brilliant. And I just want to say that I know how important it is for the world to get flying again, but I think as this call has sort of discussed so far, we need to do it in a more sustainable way, or as the Prime Minister and I discuss it, guilt-free flying. That is what we're after. We want to be able to fly the Atlantic and all around the world without causing any carbon emissions and without damaging the environment. And so with that in mind, I announced at a Downing Street press conference during COVID, actually, the Jet Zero Council and the Prime Minister and I are working on this. And the Jet Zero Council is to do exactly what we just described and actually what we've been talking about, which is to ensure the government is fully behind the measures that we've been discussing so far on this call to make sure the world can transition to zero carbon flying. And as has been said, actually very eloquently, by others. That doesn't mean just doing one thing, like it has to be electric flight or it has to be hydrogen flight. It means doing lots of different things, from sustainable aviation fuels, and we put some money into assisting with that type of research, through to, of course, things like electric hydrogen and anything else that we don't know what those things might be yet, through to just eking out greater efficiency and that side of things in the shorter, very much in the shorter term, through to things that we haven't even worked out yet, or maybe some of you guys have. Refer to other CTOs on the call with more expertise, but is it possible to run a regular engine but have carbon capture or something like that? Are all things that we would want to keep within the remit. So the Prime Minister and I are going to launch the Jet Zero Council before the summer and really try to capitalize on the kind of extraordinary ingenuity that exists both globally, but in particular in the UK. And if I may say, at the moment, I think there's a real opportunity to do that. There's not the same. I was in Washington, DC just before the COVID outbreak, before it was really getting going. And a lot of the airlines and a lot of the manufacturers are sort of talking to us about using our enthusiasm for it as a basis to ensure that it's being driven forward. So I think there's a real opportunity right now, this side of the Atlantic, to power ahead with this. Personally, I'm extremely enthusiastic about it. I'm sitting, although apparently in Farnborough, actually in my Welwyn and Hatfield constituency, just about 4 miles along the road from where the world's first commercial jet airliner was designed and built. And I would love to see the UK taking a big, strong lead in zero carbon flight, which is why the Jet Zero Council is such an important part of that. And I'll stop right there.
I really appreciate everyone for those intros. And I think as we move the discussion forward, I think Tony, Grant, all of you articulated, I think very well some of the factors related to the pandemic and sustainability. So I think Tony, you mentioned it's not an either or, right? Or even though it's oftentimes portrayed in the press as that way, right? So I kind of like to take it down another level, and maybe coming back to Tom, in the short, say near term, we have a lot of the globe is not moving. We don't see that moving, even in the medium term. And so where do you see in terms of what you're working on, which is really embedded almost entirely around sustainability moving forward? How do you see that developing in the short term? And are you doubling down? Are you, kind of slowing things down? How is that shaping up for you right now?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. I mean, I think it's a really important question, and actually one we could answer unequivocally. That we refreshed BP's purpose back in February, and all of the external challenges right now are only reinforcing the need for us as a company to make that change and to fully pursue the energy transition. I think that's absolutely unequivocal that for companies like BP to remain important companies going forwards, we have to fully embrace the energy transition, and we need to put low carbon at the center of our activities, increasingly transitioning towards that direction, and also putting people much more at the center of our purpose as well. And so, I mean, speaking as somebody who's been with BP over the last sort of 12 years or so, I'm finding it really inspiring to be working for a company that's really doing that and starting to really lead that transition from the energy industry perspective.
Okay, and Tony, when you hear that from Tom, so essentially BP's doubling down, to use his words, in terms of biofuels and where they want to move. How does that? What's your reaction to that? And again, in the short term, obviously things are tough right now, but how do you see that moving forward for your firm?
Well, I think at Etihad, we've been of the opinion for some time that, as has already been mentioned, there's not going to be one single solution, a big silver bullet. I think everybody would accept that. And it's about collaboration with a capital C and trying to pool and bring together smart ideas that contribute to more efficient ways of powered flight. And back to many of the experiments that I referred to earlier, they've all contributed in a very positive way. In terms of fuel additives, yes, we're working with Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, ADNOC, for the Saliconia plant, which is quite remarkable in a place like Abu Dhabi, where, of course, a lot of the landmass is desert. This particular plant has been designed to be able to grow in almost ungrowable conditions in salt water that wouldn't normally sustain plants, and then can be harvested for its bio contribution to a fuel mix. So it ticks many of the boxes, but like all of the other biofuels that we're working with and collaborating with the likes of BP and others with, currently the economics aren't at breakthrough level. And I think that's where, again, we need to bring not just collaborative technology partners, but also governments and broader industry players into finding ways to support some of the economic breakthroughs in that regard. But I go back to some of the real positives, I think, in all of this. And one would be, we operate one of the biggest 787 Dreamliner fleets in the world. And that aircraft, as many people know, is over 20% more fuel efficient than the previous generation. And I've been in engineering for nearly 40 years. And, in previous decades, that would be almost unheard of. Single digit improvement would have probably got us all jolly excited. So I think what this demonstrates is mankind's ability to set ambition and targets that drives different outcomes. And I think we should therefore be optimistic in that regard. But I go back to where I start. I don't think there's going to be single giant leaps. It's going to be about how we use every opportunity to get better at getting better. And I think, therefore, the blend of optimization, the blend of new technologies, but also the blend in getting smarter in how we use airspace. The roads, so to speak, that are in the skies were almost laid down by the Romans, he says with a smile on his face, because many of them haven't been reorganized ever since. they are seldomly the optimum route between A and B. And particularly when we look at some of the more busier spaces around the world and legacy protocols for how ascent and descents are operating, there's far too much fuel being burned for all the wrong reasons. So that's yet another example of adding to a broader menu of opportunity. And I think the reason why I, for one, would be optimistic that we'll definitely crack this one with the commitments that we've made. But finally, the bridge back to the current crisis, I think everybody's noticed, and it's certainly been promoted through the media, the way that the oceans have recovered since, the world has not been operating in the same way, the way forestation and animal life has recovered. So we all know this is the right thing to do, and aviation has a big part to play in that.
Thanks, Tony. Appreciate that. And building on that, Paul, it keeps coming up from the comment. There's no one silver bullet when we talk about whether it's carbon emissions, greenhouse gas reductions, et cetera. It's going to have to be a comprehensive, approach. Yeah. So from your perspective, especially on the technology side, where do you see the field of play, so to speak, in terms of the places where we think we should be focusing on more, and frankly, where's Rolls-Royce, placing their bets on that? Can you just give a little overview?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So first of all, we're all saying the same thing. There isn't one silver bullet. We need a mixture of measures, and I totally concur with all the panelists in what they've said. One of the big gains in town is sustainable aviation fuels, as has been said. And I should say, you said biofuels earlier. Actually, you can create a sustainable aviation fuel in a number of different ways. You can reprocess waste, you can grow crops. But the game in town that we've been looking at jointly with some oil and gas companies has been the use of a small nuclear power station as the energy source to create an e-fuel, which actually drives the economics right down and allows us to use a net zero sustainable aviation fuel. It's not going to be as cheap as fossils, but it's a bit more than fossils rather than 10 times the price. And that could be quite a big game changer in this whole space. Although the world does need to sort of have a coordinated view towards a regulation in order to encourage the startup of this industry. It's a massive, massive undertaking. By 2050, we estimate we'll need 500 million tons of sustainable aviation fuels, and that is an enormous amount of industrialization that's required globally to make that happen. So that's one play. On engine airframe combinations, because it is going to be a more expensive fuel, we know we're going to have to continue on the journey that Tony outlined. And we're not content just with the 20%. In fact, we need to get something like a 30% improvement in whole fleet efficiency between now and 2050 to be able to use as little as 500 megatons of fuel. So that's itself the fact that when we design engines and airplanes that use a lot less fuel, it's about reducing the cost of ownership. As the price of fuel might be a bit higher, as well as facilitating long journeys like sort of London, Sydney, and hops that we couldn't dream of before. And then the third element, and people have alluded to, is the use for sort of sub-1,000-kilometre flights of some novel propulsion technologies, where actually the interesting sort of customer benefits we're looking to open up are not just to do with environmental performance. With the EFAN-X project, which was a UK-based sort of hybrid electric project we were doing jointly with Airbus, we're exploring the idea of a regional city hopper, which not only gets the carbon footprint way down by using a lot less fuel, but gets the noise footprint down as well, and the runway length a lot shorter. So actually, it's quite an exciting new type of green aircraft that isn't just about sort of reducing the amount of CO2 that's deployed. So there's a lot of really exciting technology, and those technologies are about the flying machine. And Tony's absolutely right. On top of that, We need to look at airspace management, digital airspace management. So we use these motorways in the sky, these antediluvian airways in the sky, quite rightly, a lot more efficiency. And there'll be a role for carbon offsetting in the early years. Although we hope that aviation won't have to rely on that, because there's so many industries that want to offset carbon that eventually the bubble will burst. So our view is aviation needs to wash its own face eventually and just be net zero by 2050.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Paul. It's really helpful to give that overview. And as I hear that, Grant, I'm looking at the various things. There's public-private opportunities, for collaboration. There's certainly existing regulations around carbon offsets and the need to reduce carbon. How do you see your role in transport in the UK as both, almost like you think of the carrot and the stick, enabling and encouraging further development, but also making sure that we're meeting reduction goals, that are aligned with long term. So how do you see your role and position in that?
Well, I mean, in this is a very unusual conversation for me, because in politics I'm usually arguing people, debating in House Commons chamber or something. But here I just want to say, I just want to agree with what everybody has just said. I mean, just absolutely spot on. Actually, when Paul's talking about that, I've been to see that EFAN X. It's up at Cranfield University, and I was making a speech exactly on this subject and clambered around, and it really kind of got into my head, the complexity of the weight and heaviness of batteries. Because I think I'm right in saying it will replace one engine, but unfortunately the batteries sit exactly where the passengers should be. There's a lot of tech to work out to make that happen. It was lovely to clamber around an aircraft, again built 4 miles away from me here in Hatfield, and I absolutely pay tribute to to projects like the EFAN X, which are starting to think through these problems and technologies for the, as you rightly say, for the initially at least sub-1,000 kilometer trips, but who knows, a lot of things. I mean, the one thing I know for sure, I guess this is sort of as close as I can get to answering your question, Craig, is we just don't know what we don't know, and things like, was that a great Bill Gates quote? Was it about no one will ever need more than a megabyte or something, or 10 megs of data on their computer? But how could we have been wrong to a scale of many thousands in predicting future technology? And the only thing I'm fairly sure about, despite the best brains in the business, is we're all wrong about just how far we might be able to get by 2050, or maybe not. But our predictions will be wrong in one direction or the other. Of that I can predict confidently. Tony was making quite a big play about airspace, and I completely agree with him. It is archaic, and when we are literally, actually, Farnborough 2 years ago, I saw I think a TriStar, the last flight of a particular TriStar happened to be into Farnborough that day, and it came in, and I don't know if any of you were there, the roar was unbelievable. I mean, just unbelievable. And I was hands and ears, it was incredible. And that was just a jet airliner of its day, with that technology of its time, before the 20% improvement in just a very short period of time on the Dreamliner and all the rest of it, all the things which came before. That's how aviation used to be. And we've kind of forgotten how much quieter, even though they can still be noisy, these aircraft are. And airspace was designed around the performance of that TriStar, basically, back in the 50s and the 60s, and when climb and descent performance was pretty poor. And as a result, I'm now passing a bill, an act through Parliament, which is an airspace bill. And that airspace bill is designed to reorganise the UK's airspace in a way which would make sense. So what the hell are we doing, having aircraft turn up across the Atlantic or across Europe and then circle round, hang around in holds, pumping out CO2, delaying the passenger, increasing the environmental damage and probably the noise as well as the CO2, when they could be flying straight in? And how obviously possible is that with the kind of algorithms that we have these days, that as the aircraft's coming over the Atlantic, the computer slows it down to whatever speed, so it comes in and it gets to its slot to the minute and flies in. I mean, it literally isn't rocket science. It is quite literally possible today. We don't need to invent new fuel. We don't need to invent complex new systems. We have all the computing power required. We're just running this thing on an old-fashioned air traffic control, holding over Bovingdon or whatever the process is. And so this bill is designed to change that, and a whole load of airspace change management is going on here right now. And I think that is another small piece of the puzzle that Tony and others have referred to.
Okay. So, Tom, thinking about the value chain, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, there's some really interesting dynamics to try and manage right now, but also some great opportunities, I think. And actually, I can see a real opportunity in the way that bailouts are being applied. We believe there should be green conditions attached to those in order to really lock in the low carbon agenda to any subsequent growth. And we've kind of got this point where we can pause and reflect and really choose how we reinvigorate industries, how we lock in growth, and I think that growth should be green as much as possible going forwards. And so, I mean, that's a sort of general point. I think specifically within aviation, any conditions like that do need to be applied thoughtfully, because the industry is in so much pain right now that actually if that's applied too quickly, it could result in the industry just struggling and not able to play its full part in driving low carbon and driving the energy transition. So we need a bit of sensitivity about how that's applied, but absolutely, I think there's a big opportunity in the way that we choose to grow. The specific areas where I think we can really add focus, I mean, we've talked a bit about sustainable aviation fuel already. That really feels like the key enabler. All of these things we've talked about, like efficiency, smarter operations, will play their full role. But if we really want to, sort of tilt the curve of emissions going forward, while enabling the industry to grow overall, there's so many people in the world that have never flown. We want to enable all those people to participate in this incredible industry, the ability to travel, to connect. But to be able to have that growth, we do need to turn the curve of emissions. And actually, sustainable aviation fuel, I think, is the biggest enabler of that. So that needs some clear policy support to enable the investment in the plants to build that, and continued demand signals from policy. And we can pick that up a little bit later, Craig, as well.
So, Chris, as we are moving forward and continue to try to accelerate things, where do you see, Boeing placing its bets, both in the, say, medium and long term when it comes to sustainability?
Yeah, we're going to stay focused on all of it. And I certainly mentioned the investments we're making on the social side, and, we'll continue to do that. And of course, governance, we have to have a good governed company or we wouldn't sustain it all. But on the environmental side, first and foremost, it'll stay focused on the products, the aircraft engine combinations, the fuel efficiency of the fleet. We'll continue to invest in those things. We're very honored to have the partnerships we've had on EcoD and seen, half to 2/3 of those technologies actually migrate into the fleet. And we have to stay focused there. I do believe we'll also stay focused in the sustainable aviation fuels. There's a lot of discussion about how we get to a scaled up production and distribution system around that. And, we've made a lot of progress, 7 different pathways in terms of having different fuels and different sources that are all been certified to fly, but we have to work on the scaling now. And then at the other end, I think some people have called it, third generation, but it's really those technologies of the future. I'll call out eVTOL. That comes up a lot on one end of the spectrum, but we've used our corporate venture account to invest in companies that are early stage, but have some innovative technologies around batteries and storage. And we're participating with our Whisk JV and our Cora vehicle, looking at how we certify those systems in the airspace, our SkyGrid partnerships, looking at how we do air traffic management and connect UTM and ATM. And those are all crucial infrastructure issues that have to go along with the technology to see that scale. But those are just some of the thoughts I had. We have to continue to innovate, partner, and invest in that spectrum. There's no single answer.
So Tony, moving forward, we're all in violent agreement in terms of a path forward. But in the near term, making purchasing decisions, where do you see things going from here for you?
Well, I referred to some of the experiments that we're carrying out on the Greenliner, on those test bed optimization flights, but also the eco demonstrator that I referred to as well later on this year. But to connect that to a comment the Secretary of State also made earlier on, 2 of those eco flights that we've done earlier this year, one to Brussels to work with Eurocontrol and one to Dublin. If I just simply use the Dublin one as an example, in terms of more efficient airspace management between Abu Dhabi and Dublin, optimizing the route planning, continuous ascent, continuous descent, and all of the time on arrival planning that were referred to, saved us 40 minutes on that journey and 3 tons of CO2. So for me, whilst all of the range of things that we're working on are really important, as my mother taught me when I was a kid, always do the simple things right first and allow some of the more challenging things to follow. And I think there's probably some clues for us in that. There's no copyright on bright ideas. Everybody can contribute to improving sustainability in aviation. And the whole logic behind the Greenliner is it's not the Etihad Greenliner. It's not the Boeing Greenliner. It's actually a persona. It's actually presenting itself out there that if you've got a smart idea that can contribute to, even if it's a small one, improving the performance in aviation from a sustainability point of view, call it out and we'll try and embody it on the Greenliner program. And I think that's something that we can excite lots of other people as well, in the SME community in particular.
And Grant, when you hear that commentary from Tony, where do you see government and regulation overall playing a role here? Is it supportive? What's the key factors that you want to have to contribute moving forward?
Well, look, I would say that you have to tackle these things from both ends, kind of as Tony was saying. So you mentioned violent agreement on this panel, but actually, if you look at Corsia as a route through to resolving this whole thing, there isn't yet international agreement. So you've got some countries tentatively putting things in place, a bit more forward-leaning than others and all the rest of it. But that's not going to be the whole picture. So I think what you have to do is both do that, and certainly as a government, we're very internationalist in this. We want the world to work together. We want to work through bodies that are going to assist with that. But I don't think we can be satisfied when things then don't move fast enough and just kind of go, well, never mind, we'll just wait for another decade, because we don't have that time to do. And the reason why I think we're in a unique position, and even a unique position potentially for leadership through the Jet Zero Council on all of this, is we're the only major economy right now who's legislated by law for zero carbon by 2050 and for net zero. And we can't get there unless we sort out aviation. And, actually, I think it was Paul who mentioned before, you can sort of, I don't want to say cheat and get there, but let's put it this way. It isn't going to be acceptable either to the public or to all the other heavy industry needs that will still require to emit some carbon if aviation takes all of the carbon credits, right? So that's not a solution to this thing. And so to answer your question fully, I think you both have to work in international fora, but you also have to be prepared to invent the technology and be the convening power, and yes, put taxpayers' money into it as well, and create the kind of innovation that's going to surprise. And we don't know exactly what that innovation will be. A colleague of mine was saying we should describe this like the V-bomber, where we knew we needed a bomber and we went off and pursued a whole bunch of different things with a sort of backup if everything else failed. But it was not pursuing one solid solution until we knew that solution was really going to win the day. So I think all of those things have to be done in combination.
And so then turning to you, Chris, both you and I are sitting here in the U.S. We sharing with our colleagues in Europe and the Middle East. What's your reaction when you hear that in terms of priorities and how regulation will really play a role with this moving forward?
Yeah, I think, none of our commitments are any less reduced, and I think regulation has its place. I think our position's always been we just need to make sure that those investments and those incentives are really there to incentivize things to advance versus penalizing them. And, I think that's our united common cause, whether it's interim credit approaches that we've all stood up for under Corsia, or just investments in the technology, incentivizing the scaling of the fuels. Though that type of regulation is very effective and it's industry wide, I think that's the other thing, something that will benefit all parts of the ecosystem in the aviation value chain, and will help all the airline customers have a level playing field on that versus somebody having it tilted. I think that's why the forums that we all participate in are so important.
Okay.
And
Good.
Craig, can I just
Yeah.
apologize that, as mentioned right up
Yep.
front, this is the moment I'm going to need to drop out with 5 minutes to go. So I just want to say thank you very much to you and to everyone, and see you all in 2 years' time at Farnborough in person. I really very much hope, maybe before, but good luck with the rest of this virtual Farnborough, and hope it all goes really well.
Right. Thank you so much, Grant. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We want to accelerate. There's many opportunities. Rolls-Royce, where does that fit in for you? The opportunity, or some of the challenges that you see.
So we're being boringly repetitive, saying the same thing, but we're all working on multiple strands.
Yep.
I'd just like to agree with Tom and the Minister about sustainable fuels, that there is a political job to be done, not a technical one, of getting the world aligned on some kind of means to create the economic and regulatory conditions under which they can be scaled up. And I don't want to say what the answer is here. And a bit like the V-bomber analogy, where do you make your fuel from waste or crops or trees, or using renewables to create your fuel? It doesn't matter as long as you don't dig up fossils in the process. So that's a real sort of exciting race that's going to be on. I've repeated a couple of times that it happens that sustainability goes hand in hand with other customer benefits in the propulsion side. So our UltraFan engine, which is this big 10% step change in fuel efficiency, is an enormous fan. It's a fan so big you could drive a tube train through the fan case. So you have a very slow-moving fan that's very, very quiet as well as fuel efficient. So customers will get other benefits, namely the noise profile of the aircraft will get even lower. And then all of us in different ways are exploring, particularly for smaller aircraft, novel propulsion, pure electric, hybrid electric, hydrogen if you wish to go down that route. In our case, selling propulsion systems into the urban air mobility market, which is really exciting, bucking the trend of COVID, because they all say that the big scale up in UAM, urban air mobility, is like 2023 to 2024, so sort of during the COVID recovery period. So there's a lot of money going into that business, and it's very exciting, and it's going to produce a lot of electrification technologies that will then spill over into regional and then larger aircraft. So that's a pretty exciting space to be in too. So, we're trying to turn this sort of crisis into a great opportunity to decarbonize our business, to give a whole different image, to create new types of flying machines. And the great thing is everyone is saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. No, I appreciate that. And so we're coming up on time, and maybe I think I just go around, but again, I would just summarize. We're all aligned in terms of some key next steps that have to happen, but maybe just there are challenges. We know there are strong challenges, and maybe Tony, starting with you, what is the major challenge? The one of you pick out that you see that Etihad needs to tackle directly within your organization that will need to come to keep the needle moving forward. Just what's that one thing that you would highlight right now that you want to focus on in the near term?
I think it's a slightly different tack from majority of the conversation that we've had up to now, but it won't surprise anybody within the airline sector that it's going to be an absolute fight for survival, because the commercial implications of the aftermath of COVID, the likes of which I don't think any of us have ever seen, suggests that there's going to be a seismic shape change to the way in which our very industry goes forward. And I think that in its own way will probably in the short term dictate how aviation adjusts, where the winners and losers are in all of that, if that's not the wrong vocabulary to use. But also those who do have the opportunity to move forward, build it not only on what they've done in response to COVID, then from probably a wellness proposition similar to what we're doing at Etihad, but maintain the drive on sustainability. I think those two pillars will become the ever-present foundation stones going forward.
Thank you, Tony. Really appreciate that. Tom, your thoughts?
Thanks, Craig. I think for us in the fuel supply area, and it's just building on what I've said before, really, I think sustainable aviation fuel is within the aviation context is where, as BP, we can play the biggest role. That's something that we'll be really focusing on, helping to build the supply. That should coincide with the industry coming through the recovery phase and back to growth. It's a few years to build these plants. And working with policymakers and other stakeholders to ensure that we get the right design in any policies, in any incentive mechanisms to ensure that we really do set that industry for growth and success to really drive that energy transition all the way out to 2050.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate it. Chris?
Yeah, I think for us, and I suspect across all of our colleagues, it's really not an either or. I think maybe it put more emphasis on social in the near term, of course, but it's not an either or at all. And I think for the industry and certainly not for our company, certainly as we reset and recover, we're going to see, we believe, newer planes will enter back into the networks first. Those, of course, are going to be more fuel efficient. I think Paul mentioned the focus that we have to continue to have on the aircraft engine combination of technology and fuel efficiency. But in the longer term, we have to continue the innovation, the investments, and the partnerships that we're after for greater fuel efficiency in the products and incremental improvements we make. Sustainable aviation fuels, I know Tom will talk about that. And then the future technologies that hold a lot of promise, as Paul mentioned, but maybe a little further out in terms of maturing. But we have to keep working on those now. eVTOL on one end and eco demonstrator projects like we're proud to have partnered up with Etihad on, as Tony mentioned earlier.
Thanks, Chris. And Paul, your thoughts?
So my thoughts are that aviation is about 2 to 3% of global man-made CO2, a very important 2 to 3%, and we've got to do something about it. But I think the most important thing we can do is to speak with one voice as an industry and say, we've got a plan. We've got a plan. Aviation can and is decarbonizing at the same rate as many other industries, whether it be home heating with gas, whether it be grid-based electricity, whether it be truck-based road transportation. Actually, our trajectory towards decarbonization is potentially, when we get these sort of three pillars in place and the other measures that have been spoken about during the call, on the same path as other industries. So aviation is doing its bit, and we need to position aviation as part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Thanks, Paul. And thanks to the entire panel. This is really helpful, and I've learned a lot and really appreciate everyone taking the time. So I think I'll leave it there. And again, I echo Grant's comments. Hopefully we can see each other all in person in Farnborough in a couple of years. So thank you very much and appreciate it.